I still remember the sound of the champagne popping. The smell of lemon butter and char-grilled salmon filled the banquet hall. Our servers, some of whom had been with us for over a decade, moved between the round tables like clockwork. The walls were decorated with framed photos. Opening day, the first feature in Bon Appetit, our third location ribbon cutting. It was our 25th anniversary. A quarter century of Sorella, the family restaurant I had poured my entire adult life into. We were celebrating at a hotel ballroom in Chicago, where our original restaurant had opened its doors back in 1999. I had just turned 36. I'd been running the business since I was 26, stepping in after my father's heart attack. At first, they just needed someone to keep the doors open. But I stayed, grew it, scaled it, and built Sorella into something bigger than any of them had imagined. So when my Uncle Frank tapped his fork against a wine glass and stood to give a speech, I assumed I knew what was coming. A tribute to my father. Maybe a few kind words about me. Instead, he turned to my cousin David. "I just want to take a moment," he said, smiling proudly, "to recognize someone who's shown incredible promise. Someone who truly understands what Sorella means to this family. The future of this brand. The person I believe will lead us into the next 25 years. My son, David." There was a pause, then clapping. I looked around the room. The applause spread quickly. My aunt, my cousins, two of the investors I had brought in years ago. Even the lawyer we hired last year to oversee the Arizona location stood and raised a glass. I just blinked. David smiled awkwardly, like he hadn't known it was coming. But I knew better. His modesty was too well rehearsed. I forced a smile and took a sip of my drink, the bitterness cutting sharper than the alcohol. The kind of smile you wear when you're surrounded by people who just voted you out of your own story and didn't even have the decency to warn you first. I found an excuse to step outside, claiming I needed to take a call. In reality, I just needed to breathe. For 10 years, I had sacrificed everything. Nights, weekends, relationships. I skipped birthdays, gave up 2 job offers from national chains, and cashed out my 401k to help open the second location. It was my strategy that got us into the airport food court contract. My late nights that landed us a glowing write-up in Food and Wine. My name on the credit applications when no one else would sign. David? He joined 2 years ago, worked part-time in marketing. He made a few flashy videos for TikTok, suggested a new logo, and showed up to one zoning meeting where he fell asleep halfway through. But he was Frank's son. And Frank, being my dad's older brother, still carried the illusion that he was the true patriarch of the brand. Later that night, I walked back into the ballroom. People were mingling, laughing. Someone had already ordered cake. I didn't confront anyone. I just smiled, posed for a few pictures. Let them believe I didn't care. Because they had no idea what they'd just done. I had learned the hard way that family and business don't always mix. That's why, 4 years ago, when we opened the franchise in Austin, I hired my own legal counsel and insisted on reviewing every operating contract personally. At the time, they thought I was paranoid, overly cautious. But it wasn't paranoia. It was preparation. The next morning, I arrived at the flagship restaurant in River North at 6:45 a.m., before the rest of the team. I always did on Mondays. It gave me time to go through invoices and prep for the weekly operations call. At 7:30, Frank and David walked in. Their faces said everything. "Sophie," Frank started, not even looking guilty, "we've decided it's time for a transition. David will be stepping in as managing director." I didn't blink. I just folded my laptop shut, stood up, and looked at them both. "Okay," I said. "But you might want to double-check the franchise contracts before you get too comfortable." David frowned. "Why?" I grabbed my folder from the filing cabinet, pulled out a copy, and tapped the paragraph I had highlighted years ago. "Because if I'm removed from operational leadership without just cause," I said calmly, "those contracts are subject to immediate review and may be invalidated under the non-compete clause." Frank's face fell. David just stared. They had no idea, but they were about to find out. David stood frozen, the paper in his hands trembling slightly. His lips moved, but no sound came out. Frank leaned in to read over his shoulder, eyes narrowing as he skimmed the clause I had pointed to. Section 7.4, Leadership Clause. In the event of a leadership transition involving the removal or replacement of the operational director without cause, the franchise licensing agreement shall be subject to legal review, with full discretion granted to the original operational signatory. They hadn't read it. I could tell by their faces. They'd signed those documents when we launched the Austin and Denver locations, treating it like paperwork, not realizing the power they had handed me in the fine print. "You're bluffing," Frank said finally, his voice low and tight. I raised an eyebrow. "Am I?" I reached into my bag and handed him a second folder. "This is a legal summary prepared by the same attorney who reviewed all 4 of our franchise agreements. Her contact information is on the inside cover. Feel free to give her a call." David looked up, color draining from his face. "Wait, this clause gives you the right to suspend operations?" "If I'm removed without board approval and without written cause," I replied calmly, "which neither of you have." "You're not on the board," Frank snapped. "True," I said, "but I do control the franchise operations. You signed that over in 2019 when I personally invested in our expansion. You needed capital, remember? No bank would touch us without a proven operations executive." Frank went quiet. I could see the wheels spinning in his head, trying to recall every step he had taken. But the truth was, I had been one step ahead for years. I hadn't expected to need it. But I'd learned enough watching how decisions got made behind closed doors to know that if the day ever came, I needed to protect what I built. David looked like he was about to be sick. "So, what does this mean?" "It means," I said, "if you try to proceed with removing me, I have the legal authority to halt all franchise activity, pending litigation. That includes vendor agreements, supply chains, kitchen licensing, and employee contracts at every single franchise location." David opened his mouth, then shut it again. Frank was still glaring at me, like he couldn't quite believe this was happening. "You knew we might do this," he said quietly. I nodded. "I knew it was possible. Not because I thought you were evil, just careless, entitled. You've always treated Sorella like a family inheritance, but it wasn't handed to me. I earned every square inch of it." Frank let out a bitter laugh. "You think you're the only one who's worked hard for this family?" "No," I said evenly. "But I am the only one who turned a failing restaurant into a multi-million-dollar brand while the rest of you sat back and collected dividend checks." He took a step forward. "You don't want to start a war, Sophie?" I met his gaze. "Then don't start one." The silence stretched between us for a long moment. David looked from me to his father, then back again. "So, what now?" I took a breath. "Now, I suggest we do what we should have done in the first place. Talk to the board. Call an emergency meeting. Let them weigh in. But if either of you moves forward without due process, I'll file for injunctions this afternoon." Frank muttered something under his breath. "I'm not trying to burn this place down," I added, "but I'm not letting you erase me either." With that, I turned and walked out of the office, my pulse hammering in my ears. Once outside, I didn't go back to work. I got in my car and drove straight to my lawyer's office downtown. She had already read the room better than I had months ago when I'd asked her to double-check all operational clauses, just in case. "I had a feeling you'd be in today," she said, waving me into her office. "They actually did it," I said, sitting down. "They tried to replace me." She sighed and pulled out a legal pad. "Do you want to fight this quietly or publicly?" I hesitated, then said, "Let's start quiet. But be ready to go loud." I left her office with the signed affidavit in my bag and copies of all 4 franchise agreements in my hand. Back at the restaurant, the tension had already shifted. Staff were whispering. Our general manager, Luis, gave me a silent nod as I walked in. He had heard. The battle had officially begun. But what Frank and David didn't know? I wasn't just fighting to keep my job. I was fighting to protect everything I had built from the very people who thought they could steal it and get away with it. The following morning, I arrived at the restaurant before the sun rose. Not because I had to, because I needed to. I wanted to see who would show up, who would greet me like they always had, and who would avoid eye contact. In a family business, loyalty is rarely about performance. It's about blood. And I was about to find out just how much of that loyalty was real. Luis, our general manager, was already prepping the kitchen for the lunch shift. He looked up and gave me a half smile. "Morning, boss." I nodded. "Thanks for being here." He gave a small shrug. "This place only runs because of you. We all know that." I was grateful, but I didn't let it show. I was too used to people changing their minds the moment power shifted, so I kept my guard up. By 8 a.m., the whispers had begun. Word had gotten out. Frank and David had told a few department heads that I'd be stepping aside and that David would be taking over the transition, effective immediately. It wasn't a formal announcement, but it was enough to rattle people. And they had timed it well. Tuesday was our supplier meeting, where we usually reviewed monthly orders, new menu items, and expansion updates. This time, it felt more like a silent war zone. I walked into the meeting room to find a few longtime staff already seated. Maria from marketing, John from operations, and Elise, our finance director. David stood at the front, awkwardly shuffling papers like he had something important to say. Frank wasn't in the room, but his presence lingered in every stiffened back and averted gaze. David cleared his throat. "Before we get started, I just want to thank everyone for their ongoing commitment during this exciting new chapter." I sat down at the far end of the table, arms folded. David glanced at me but didn't meet my eyes. "As you've probably heard," he continued, "there's been a shift in leadership. Starting this week, I'll be overseeing daily operations." "According to who?" I interrupted, my voice calm but firm. The room froze. David hesitated. We made the decision as a family." "That's not how operational leadership is determined," I said. "There are franchise agreements, board approvals, legal processes, none of which have happened." David's face turned red. "Sophie, let's not make this uncomfortable." "You already did that," I said. Then I turned to the others in the room. "I've led this company for 10 years. Every expansion, every menu overhaul, every growth phase came from this table with your help. Now ask yourselves, do you really want to follow someone who's been in this business for 15 minutes just because his last name matches the sign out front?" Silence. Maria looked down at her notes. Elise shifted in her chair. No one defended David, but no one spoke up either. I stood. "This meeting is over." David's jaw clenched. "You can't just walk out." I smiled coldly. "Watch me." And I did. Back in my office, I sent 2 emails. One to our legal team, instructing them to notify the franchisees that no leadership change was authorized and that any communications from David or Frank were unofficial. The second, to the board. Subject: Emergency session request. Leadership challenge. I requested an emergency meeting. According to our bylaws, any board member with executive authority could call for one within 48 hours. I was within my rights, and I had documentation to back every move I made. But what I didn't have yet was certainty about where the board's loyalty lay. Frank had influence. He'd been one of the original co-founders. Some of the board members had known him for 20 years. And while they respected me, respect didn't always translate to votes. That evening, I called Luis again. "How bad is it?" I asked. There was a pause on the line. Then, "Half the staff are watching to see who wins. The other half are hoping you do." "And David?" "He's calling meetings, trying to win people over, talking about vision and fresh energy. But he's nervous. You can tell." I thanked him, hung up, and sat in silence. This wasn't just about titles anymore. It was about trust, influence, control. And tomorrow I'd have to fight not just for my job, but for the soul of the company I built. Because Frank and David weren't backing down. They were just getting started. 2 days later, I walked into the boardroom at 9 a.m., sharp. The air was colder than usual, heavy with pretense. The long mahogany table gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and the 12 leather chairs around it were all occupied, except for mine. I took my seat at the far end. Across from me sat Frank, flanked by David. David looked nervous. He should have. He was out of his depth, and deep down, he knew it. But Frank? He looked composed, smug, like a man confident he had the votes lined up before the game even started. One by one, the board members greeted me with professional courtesy. Neutral, cautious. No one smiled. Then Charles Mitchell, our board chair, cleared his throat. "I believe we all know why we're here," he said, his voice clipped. "There's been a dispute regarding the role of managing director." "Dispute," I repeated, almost under my breath. "That's one word for it." He ignored me. "Frank, since this request originated on your end, we'll begin with you." Frank stood, buttoning his suit jacket. He always did that before speaking, as if fabric could somehow lend authority. "First, let me say that we are deeply grateful for everything Sophie has done for Sorella. Her dedication is undeniable. But as we look ahead to the next 25 years, we believe new leadership is essential. Someone with fresh ideas, a stronger public presence, and the ability to modernize our brand." He gestured to David. "My son has been working closely with our marketing and social media teams for over a year. His recent campaign tripled engagement and brought in a younger demographic. This is the direction we need to go." I let him finish. Then I stood slowly. "Thank you, Frank," I said, my voice steady. "Now let's talk facts." I tapped the tablet in front of me, and the wall screen behind me lit up with data. Growth charts, revenue spikes, franchise expansion timelines. In the past 10 years, we've gone from one struggling restaurant to a 4-location franchise valued at over $5 million. That growth didn't happen because of viral Instagram posts. It happened because of operational strategy, risk management, vendor negotiations, and a team I personally built from the ground up. I turned to face the board. I didn't inherit this company. I rebuilt it. Every milestone you see on that screen, every contract, every renovation, every new hire, was approved and executed under my leadership. David shifted uncomfortably. He was starting to sweat. "But let's set all of that aside," I continued, "because this isn't about preference. It's about legality." I pulled up a second document. This is the franchise licensing agreement, signed in 2019 and updated in 2021. It clearly states that any change to operational leadership must be reviewed and approved by this board and accompanied by written cause. There was no review, and no cause. The room was silent. No one blinked. I know some of you are close with Frank. I respect that. But if you allow this kind of internal power grab, you're setting a precedent that undermines everything we've built. Then I paused, letting the next sentence land hard. "And if I walk today, every franchise agreement goes with me." Gasps weren't common in boardrooms, but I got one. Charles leaned forward. "You're saying you would revoke the licenses?" "I'm saying," I replied, "that you'd be left with 4 properties, no operational continuity, no management infrastructure, and, most critically, no brand." Frank jumped in. "This is extortion. This is business," I said calmly. "The kind you forgot how to do a long time ago." Charles cleared his throat again. "Let's move to a vote." Frank looked smug again. Too smug. That's when I knew. He'd gotten to someone. The votes came in, one by one. 4 for David, 3 for me, 2 abstained, 1 left. All eyes turned to Elise. She had always been neutral, finance first, non-confrontational. She looked at me, then at David, then down at her tablet. "I vote in favor of Sophie," she said. Frank shot up. "Elise." She cut him off. "Enough, Frank. I've worked under both of them. Only one of them knows what they're doing. Final tally, 5-4. I had won, barely. As I gathered my things, I looked at David. You didn't lose because you're young, I said softly. You lost because you tried to skip the part where you earn it. Then I looked at Frank. And you? You forgot who was keeping your name on the building. I walked out of the boardroom into a hallway that suddenly felt warmer, lighter. But I knew better than to celebrate, because men like Frank don't lose quietly. And David wasn't going to disappear. They were going to try again. Only next time, they'd come at me from the outside. The board vote was done. I had won. But the victory felt fragile, like glass that could shatter under pressure. I knew Frank wasn't going to walk away with his pride bruised and his son publicly humiliated. That wasn't who he was. And I didn't have to wait long to find out exactly what he was planning next. 2 days later, the first article dropped. Leadership rift at Sorella. Sources say founder's daughter refused to step aside. The headline hit local business blogs first. Then it crept into national restaurant publications. The article was filled with vague, insider sources and cleverly phrased half-truths. It painted me as a power-hungry control freak, unwilling to embrace modern leadership or share credit with the next generation. There was no mention of the board vote, no mention of the contracts, no mention of the 10 years I spent rebuilding this company from the ground up. Just quotes like, "Some say she runs the business like a dictatorship." Others believe the brand needs a younger, more innovative voice. I stared at the screen, fists clenched on my desk. Frank was doing what he did best, reframing reality. And this time, he had help. Within hours, investors started calling. A few politely asked for clarification. Others weren't so polite. Should we be concerned about leadership instability? Is this why expansion into San Diego stalled? Is it true you refused to hire a chief marketing officer because you felt threatened? I took a deep breath before answering each one. Calm, measured, factual. But inside, I was seething. That evening, Luis knocked on my office door and stepped in quietly. "Word is," he said, "Frank's been calling vendors, asking if they'd work with David directly, hinting at a restructure." I leaned back in my chair. Of course he has. And one more thing, Luis added hesitantly. A few of the newer staff at the flagship, front of house, called out sick today. Same ones David hired. Might not be a coincidence. It wasn't. It was a message. He couldn't beat me inside the system, so now he was trying to make me look like I couldn't control my own business. Undermine morale, disrupt daily operations, rattle the board, and worst of all, make me doubt myself. But what Frank didn't understand was that I'd spent a decade in crisis mode. I'd dealt with burst pipes during dinner service, 3 lawsuits, 2 kitchen fires, and a global pandemic. He wanted a public war? Fine. The next morning, I scheduled a press release. No denials, no counter-smears, just facts. Sorella is proud to confirm its leadership structure remains unchanged following a routine board vote, with Sophie Harper continuing in her role as managing director. Under her leadership, the brand has expanded into 4 markets and grown revenue by over 350% in 10 years. The board remains confident in her vision for the future. It was short, precise, unapologetic. Then I called in my own favor, an old friend who worked as a producer on a regional business show. 3 days later, I sat down in a TV studio across from a well-known anchor. He introduced me as the woman behind one of the Midwest's fastest-growing restaurant franchises. "I have to ask," he said, leaning in with a smile. "What's your secret?" I smiled back. Relentless hard work, strategic growth, and learning to tune out the noise. He laughed. "That sounds like a subtle nod to some of the recent headlines." I kept my voice steady. "If doing my job well makes me difficult, I can live with that." The interview aired that evening, and for the first time in weeks, the narrative shifted. Investors stopped calling. Customers sent messages of support. Our Instagram saw a surge of engagement, not because of David's youthful energy, but because people respect resilience. But not everyone was pleased. That night, I received a message from an anonymous number. "Enjoy the spotlight. You've made enemies." I stared at it for a moment, then deleted it. Not because I wasn't rattled, but because I knew fear was the whole point. This wasn't just about contracts or press coverage anymore. Frank and David wanted to break me. Publicly. Personally. But they were forgetting something. I'd already survived the hardest part. Building everything from nothing. Now, I was just protecting what was mine. And I wasn't done yet. Because I had one more move left. One that would remind them exactly who they were dealing with. 2 weeks after the board vote, the media firestorm, and the anonymous threats, the dust finally began to settle. But I hadn't. I was still working 16-hour days, still in my office before sunrise, still walking the kitchen line during dinner rush. But it wasn't fear driving me anymore. It was clarity. Because I knew that if I wanted peace, real peace, I had to do more than just survive Frank and David's betrayal. I had to close the door behind them. For good. And I knew exactly how to do it. It started with a call to Elise, our finance director, the same board member whose vote had saved me. "I want a full audit," I told her. "Quiet, internal. Go back 5 years." She didn't ask questions. She just nodded. "Got it." I had my suspicions. Little things I'd noticed over the years. Frank had always handled legacy accounts. The vendor contracts for our original Chicago suppliers had never been fully transitioned to my department. It was a gray area, one I had allowed out of respect. Loyalty. Now I knew better. 2 days later, Elise walked into my office holding a thick file. "I didn't think you were right," she said, "but you were." She dropped the folder on my desk. Inside, invoices, payment discrepancies, vendor kickbacks. Nothing explosive, but enough to show a clear pattern of self-dealing. Frank had been funneling a portion of the vendor rebates to a side company registered under his name. One that billed us for consulting. It wasn't illegal per se, but it was unethical, and a breach of our internal policy. And David? His name was on a few of the invoices too. I sat in silence for a moment, then slowly picked up the phone. "Elise," I said, still holding the file. "Notify the board. We're calling a vote for removal." "Just Frank?" she asked. I looked down at David's signature. "Both." 1 week later, we met again in the boardroom. Frank came in looking defiant. David looked exhausted. "I know what this is," Frank said before the meeting began. "This is personal." "No," I replied. "This is business. You taught me that, remember?" I handed out the documents. I didn't need a big speech. The numbers spoke for themselves. Vendor kickbacks, false reimbursements, misappropriated funds. David tried to explain. Said he just signed what his father gave him. That he didn't know. I believed him. But that didn't mean I was going to protect him. The vote was swift. 8-1. Effective immediately, Frank and David were removed from all positions and privileges within Sorella. Frank's shares were frozen pending investigation. David's severance was denied. It was done. But I wasn't finished. That weekend, I hosted a staff meeting. No press, no PR spin, just our full team, packed into the flagship location. "I want to tell you all something," I said, standing in front of the open kitchen. "This restaurant isn't mine because my name is Harper. It's mine because I showed up when no one else did. Because I worked the fryers when we were short-staffed and mopped the floors when our dishwasher quit mid-shift. I know many of you did the same. And we're still here. Together." I paused, looking at familiar faces. Servers who'd been with us since the second location. Cooks who had followed me across state lines. We're not just rebuilding a brand anymore. We're protecting a legacy. One built with sweat, not signatures. Applause erupted. Not polite, not forced, real. And for the first time in a long time, I felt something I hadn't let myself feel since this all began. Relief. A year later, Sorella crossed $10 million in revenue. We opened in 2 new cities, we launched a training program for women in culinary leadership. And the board? Rebuilt, transparent, accountable. Frank never reached out again. David sent a short email once. No apology, just a line that read, "You were right." I wasn't ready. I didn't respond. Because closure doesn't always come from conversation. Sometimes it comes from letting go of people who only show up when the credit rolls in. Now, when I walk through the original Chicago kitchen, I don't feel bitterness anymore. I feel pride. Not because I won, but because I stayed standing when everyone expected me to fold. Because I proved, not to them, but to myself, that strength isn't inherited. It's built. Dish by dish, shift by shift, contract by contract. So the next time someone asks me how I kept my company from being stolen, I'll tell them this. I didn't fight to stay in power. I fought to protect what I created from people who thought they could claim it without earning it. And that's something I'll never be sorry for.